Cunliffe.
Speaker, to the Minister, what was the earliest date that Treasury formed the conclusion that South Canterbury Finance could fail? And when and by whom was that first raised with him?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, we need to bear in mind the retail deposit scheme, guarantee scheme, was put in place in October 2008 for the very reason that there was a distinct possibility that some financial organisations could fail. Without the view that they could fail, the guarantee would not have been needed. And that was reasonably obvious given that 45 financial organisations had already failed before the retail guarantee was introduced. With respect to South Canterbury Finance, the Treasury reached a view that they were more likely than not to fail on the 13th of August 2009. That decision was reflected in the inclusion of South Canterbury Finance in the provision of $831 million reported in the Crown accounts as at June 30th 2009 for all companies under the Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme. I was informed by Treasury of their view in August 2009. Yesterday I incorrectly suggested that the provisioning decisions were made in March or April 2009 when in fact they were made in August.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, given his answer that he knew that there was a, quote, more than even chance that South Canterbury Finance would fail, close quote, as early as the preparation of the Crown accounts, did he discuss with the Minister of Commerce or his officials placing South Canterbury Finance into statutory management or receivership by or around June 2009, and if not, why not?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I don't recall that discussion or any discussion of that nature. There was some work done on the general concept of the difference between the government using statutory management or receivership, which I think was a responsible work to do, given that we were guaranteeing dozens of institutions that had the potential to fail. Discussions that were focused particularly on South Canterbury Finance would not have occurred, or probably didn't occur up until this year.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, given the government's stated objective to minimise the cost to taxpayers of the bailout, how did he expect to reduce the cost to taxpayers by allowing South Canterbury Finance to trade on past June 2009 when provisions in the Crown accounts prove that the government knew it was already in a negative equity position by that time?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the point here is simply that both the government and the company made every effort to avoid any cost to the taxpayer at all. So if the company had been able to be recapitalised, or if it had been able to generate sufficient inflows of deposits, then it was possible up until quite recently before the receivership that the company would not have failed at all, and that of course was the preferred option.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Given that answer, would the taxpayer's liability for South Canterbury Finance have been lower if his government had not decided on 1 April 2010 to then include South Canterbury Finance in the extended Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme, given that CEO Sandy Meyer has said the company used that extension to obtain extra funding? And if not, why not?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the important thing to remember here is the guarantee was not a guarantee of the company, it was a guarantee of the depositors. And in fact, South Canterbury Finance had been running down its deposits, so it's quite possible that we paid out less with a receivership recently than we would have in April when the book was bigger. And secondly, we need to remember that at the time it was almost certain that if the government had not announced an extension, South Canterbury would have failed there and then. Our option was to try and give them the opportunity that they asked for, which was to see if they could succeed in rebuilding the company so there was no liability to the taxpayer.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, approximately how much extra taxpayer liability would the government have avoided if it had intervened in June 2009, and what was the rationale for incurring the additional taxpayer liability after that date?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, I think the first point I'd make, Mr. Speaker, is that earlier, even as late as early 2010, no one really had that good a grip on the assets or liabilities of South Canterbury Finance. In fact, it became clear that with Corda Mentha in there, the government did have a better idea than the company itself until Mr Meyer came on the job. So the kind of calculation the member is postulating never really occurred. The government's approach was that, knowing there was potentially very large liability, we wanted to make sure the company had every opportunity to succeed so that there was no liability. And we made decisions along the way which, in our view, did not increase the taxpayers' liability but gave the company the best opportunity to succeed. In the end, they didn't.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Finance, how does...
Order. Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How does the Minister explain the apparent conflict between his claim that the great majority of problem lending occurred prior to South Canterbury Finance entering the guarantee scheme and the comments by the Chief Executive of South Canterbury Finance, Sandy Meyer, that South Canterbury used its acceptance into the guarantee scheme to ramp up its risky lending?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I think Mr Meyer actually, I think what he said was that they used the extension of the guarantee scheme to get more deposits in, and that was obviously part of the drive to see if the company could carry on. With respect to the lending, one just simply has to look at the figures that are published, and those figures show that most of the problem lending occurred before South Canterbury went into the guarantee. And with respect to the likelihood of the company failing, I'd point the House to the financial statements of the Government of New Zealand for the 11 months ended 31 May 2009. Even in May 2009, there was no provision for South Canterbury Finance because at that stage Treasury did not believe there was a more than even possibility they would fail, whereas by August 2009 they believed there was.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given this level of what you could only say is fundamental uncertainty concerning some of the basic facts, that is, whether the level of risky borrowing increased after the guarantee or didn't, why wouldn't he support having some kind of select committee inquiry or public inquiry into the events surrounding South Canterbury, given the amount of public money involved?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, that in the end is a matter for the select committee. What the government is doing is that shortly when we just simply have the time and the resource, the government will issue all the documents it can related to the deposit guarantee scheme, and that will give the member, along with anyone else, the opportunity to scrutinise all the relevant information and decide what further questions need to be answered.
Question number 4.